Welcome to Inside India. I'm Amitabh Singh, and these are your headlines on a happy Monday. India demanding answers from Indigo's CEO as the country's largest carrier struggles to get off the ground. Travelers remain in limbo and mass flight cancellations continue. The Indian markets will be looking to build on Friday's gains after the RBI rate cut. All eyes this week on the Fed decision, plus a slew of IPOs. India and Russia agreeing to deepen trade ties with President Vladimir Putin offering the South Asian country unlimited fuel supplies as US officials head to New Delhi this week for trade talks. Happy Monday. We're going to get started with what's happening in the Asian markets. And for that, we have JP Ong right here with us in the studio. JP, what's going on?
Yeah, good morning, Amitabh. And again, at the start of the new trading week, we're seeing that markets across the Asia-Pacific looking a bit mixed and muted and a bit cautious, actually. And that might be the case, actually, as we get closer and closer to that much-anticipated Fed decision this coming Thursday, with many traders perhaps not taking any chances before that and moving in more cautious fashion. You're seeing it being a bit mixed and cautious, as we mentioned a while ago. Japanese markets worth focusing on today. We did get numbers earlier today, updated numbers with regards to third quarter GDP figures that showed the world's fourth largest economy contracting by an even bigger than expected clip, actually. But we're seeing so far that the Japanese Nikkei 225 is mixed to the down, is flat to the downside, but JGB yields are also rising. There's still expectations the BOJ might hike rates by next week, actually, which is also why the Japanese yen is also strengthening, much to the chagrin of equities out in Tokyo. Now, worth also looking at how greater Chinese markets are trading today, because also looking quite mixed and diverging. You have mainland Chinese markets looking fairly solid today, but the Hang Seng down, with the exception of the Hang Seng Tech and Mainland Property Index also in gaining so far, as markets in China, whether it be Shanghai and Hong Kong, look for more direction, especially with the expectation of more macro data to give them more of a pulse check or a clearer pulse check as to where markets and the world's second largest economy might be heading as we get closer and closer to the end of the year. Amitabh, back to you.
Thanks for that, JP. We're also watching what's going on in the Indian markets. They come online in about 43 minutes. Here's what Gift Nifty futures are indicating at this point in time. Muted start, Nifty 50 at 26,186 at Friday close. We're going to be watching a couple of things. The first is how the market really reacts after fully digesting the RBI commentary over the weekend, after the RBI, the central bank in India, delivered a 25 basis point rate cut. Analysts expect markets to remain positive, not just because of the rate cut, but because of the announced liquidity actions to the tune of 16 billion USD and continued domestic flows and the potential of a US Federal Reserve rate cut. But the lack of official commentary on the rupee from the RBI, apart from really shrugging off comments during the press conference, suggests that the rupee could continue to weaken if there is no trade deal with the US announced. All right, to one of our top stories of the day and one of the worst airline crises India has seen in recent years. Indigo cancelling thousands of flights after it failed to implement new government rules limiting man hours for pilots. Monica Petrelli, our travel and transport reporter, is right here with me to discuss this. Monica, just give us a sense of how this could happen and what's the latest.
So the latest is slightly good news. It seems like Friday might have been the worst, and things starting to stabilize here over the weekend. We see the Ministry of Civil Aviation saying that airports in India and the major cities now are starting to return to normal. Those big crowds, we can see them right there. A lot of those have dissipated. Indigo, for its part, saying yes, cancellations persist, but they're getting fewer by the day. On-time performance, we saw that last week around 30%, very atypical for Indigo. That has shot back up to around 75%. Now Indigo saying this is looking like full restoration of operations within the week. But that doesn't mean that people don't want answers. And this is both passengers, and now we're seeing regulators saying they too would like to know why this has happened. We saw over the weekend the Director General of Civil Aviation saying that Indigo had significant lapses in two areas. One, the planning for these new rules, but also in how it notified and dealt with the passengers that were affected by the cancellations. And this notice, we saw a show cause notice being issued and asking CEO Peter Elber, saying you have 24 hours to tell us why we should not institute enforcement action against you. Now, Indigo did ask for and achieved an extension on that. That's going to end tonight around 6 p.m. this evening. But also we see another exemption, this one pretty major. The very rules that caused this entire cancellation disruption to happen, aviation regulators walking back on some of these, not all. but like the night landings. They had limited how many times a pilot can land at night. Some of these being granted what it's being called a temporary extension through February.
Right.
But yeah, we see obviously Indigo taking a big hit. Shares down around 9% since this started last week.
5 days.
Yes, and the government also having to step in and cap airfares, which had gone up over the weekend, and also really holding Indigo's feet to the fire in another way, saying refunds, we want them out by Sunday night. The government saying around $68 million so far has been returned in the form of a refund.
All right, okay. It's about accountability, right? Because the scenes, and I just want to paint a quick picture of that, because on Friday the focus on headlines and news channels was on Putin. But midway through that, while President Putin was meeting the Prime Minister and the President of India, the headlines switched, and all the focus went to Indigo and all the flyers who were stranded at airports. It was a chaos. So where is the accountability, and what does this mean for somebody who's looking at India's aviation sector?
Now, I think within India, a lot of anger right now directed at Indigo, which is rather rare. This is a very trustworthy airline. A lot of people are very happy with Indigo. It's a low-cost carrier, but it's one that people love. Indigo, we're kind of really operating in its own sphere there. So within the passengers are being affected, a lot of online ire directed at the airline. But I think if we take a global look, we see Indian regulators trying to clamp down, trying to increase safety standards, and we see this sort of situation happen. But of course, another question, why is it only Indigo? And Indigo is the largest airline in India, of course, but the other airlines seemingly able to deal with this at some point. We have not seen cancellations from those. We do see Air India last year saying the airlines and the pilot associations and the regulators for a long time have been discussing this. This has been years in the making. And these rules, they were stair-stepped in. This is a phased approach. There was notice given, although we have reached out and asked Indigo, what really is happening here? But I think from a global standpoint, this doesn't look good for Indian aviation, which is really growing. There's a big story here, a big growth story. So is it growing too fast? Do the safety regulations need to catch up? A lot of things will be discussed even after this is resolved, if it does happen this week.
Well, we'll wait to hear back from Indigo. If at all they do speak out at this point in time, it's going to be difficult for them to communicate to everyone about what's really going on, because those are very intricate questions, and they have 24 hours to respond to the government too. Monica, thanks so much for tracking that. Appreciate it. And that's not the only thing, as Monica was indicating. There's a lot more going on in the India aviation sector. India will send investigators to the US next week to review data with the National Transportation Safety Board on the deadly Air India crash in June, according to Bloomberg reports. Officials plan to share findings, including information from the jet's cockpit voice and flight data recorders, as the probe moves forward. And coming up, the Indian central bank opening the door to more easing after delivering a 25 basis point cut on Friday. We'll get Goldman Sachs' view on this and India's growth trajectory after a short break. Welcome back. The Fed's preferred gauge of inflation, the PCE, slowing to 2.8% for the month of November, a sign the U.S. economy is losing steam as high prices bite. Markets expect the Fed will very likely cut rates by 25 basis points later this week, with CME's Fed Watch tool currently forecasting an 88% chance of a cut on softer spending and cooler core inflation. Now, that decision is due Thursday morning Asia time. A quick check on U.S. Treasury yields right now. Take a look at that. The 2-year at 3.55, the 5-year at 3.7, and of course the 10-year, that's the focus, 4.13, and the 30-year at 4.79. We're watching all the developments regarding the Treasury yields. There's a lot happening in global markets, but let's just bring you back into what's happening in India. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, speaking at a forum, says India's economy will grow at least 7% this year, supported by strong fundamentals, steady consumption, low inflation, and recent GST cuts. She was speaking to a domestic media outlet, and she added that investor confidence remains firm, with rising retail market activity and home loan demand. On the rupee's depreciation, Nirmala Sitharaman said it will find its natural level, adding that exporters are benefiting. On policy, the Indian finance minister said customs simplification will be the government's next major reform push, aiming for more transparency and easier compliance. These key announcements are really expected in the Feb 1st budget, she indicated. Meantime, the RBI cut its repo rate by 25 basis points to 5.25% on Friday, marking 125 BPS of easing in 2025 and signaled room for more cuts as inflation falls below its target band. The Indian Central Bank also announced up to 16 billion in liquidity support through bond purchases and forex swaps to keep credit flowing. The RBI raised its GDP forecast for the current fiscal year to 7.3% and lowered inflation to 2%, even as global pressures, including higher US tariffs and a weaker rupee, weigh on the economy. Governor Sanjay Malhotra said India is in a rare Goldilocks phase with strong growth and rapid disinflation, and that policy will continue to support growth. Joining us now,
the growth inflation balance, especially the benign inflation outlook on both headline and core, continues to provide the policy space to support the growth momentum.
All right, joining us now to discuss that and more is Shantanu Sengupta. He's the chief India economist at Goldman Sachs. Shantanu, thanks so much for being with us. I want to get a sense from you at the top about the rate cut. And did you read this as a neutral stance, or did the commentary from the press conference reflect something dovish?
Yeah, thanks, Amitoj. So we had the 25 basis points cut call going into the meeting. The market had taken the cut out almost. Look, our sense is that this is likely the end of the cycle, and the governor, as you pointed out, has moved towards financial conditions easing through liquidity measures, both the OMO, 1 trillion INR worth of OMO purchase, and the FX buy-sell swap worth $5 billion. The situation where we think that they can get more dovish is if growth surprises a little bit on the downside going into next year. That can open up room. But on inflation, it seems to us that this was likely the bottom. You're going up towards 3% in the next quarter and likely towards 4% in the quarter after that. So really the room to ease from inflation in particular will be relatively limited.
Okay. I also want to draw your attention to one other comment that was made during the press conference. And there's obviously the difference between what he said when he announced the rate cut and then the written commentary that we've got and the press conference. He said in the press conference to a question that going forward due to benign inflation, we expect it to be lower. And we expect that policy rates to be low and not high. Would it be too much of an interpretation to think that he's suggesting that, yeah, we're open to more rate cuts?
Amitoj, our interpretation of that statement was that it means more likely lower for longer, rather than getting into the market pricing a rate hike anytime soon. I think in our mind also the rate hike is off the table, at least for the next few quarters. And that statement for us indicated that they would want to hold at least at 5-quarter, which is what the current repo rate is, for the foreseeable future, and concentrate on the transmission, as I'm saying, of rates
right.
fully through.
Yeah, I understand. Thanks so much. I just want clarity on that. Now, you also said that this is conditional on low growth surprise. If there is lower growth data that comes in the coming year, coming months, and remember that is possible because the new base calculation of GDP is coming in February. So most likely that will be lower in some context. Can you make that connection that there will be lower growth rate because of the base, and then as a result of that, the RBI will further cut?
More than the base change, our view is that you had a front loading of growth due to exports to the US. Some production front loading had also happened. As we speak in this quarter, you're having the current account widen, and you've seen the trade deficit numbers being wider than what it was in the previous quarter, due to mainly two reasons. One, lower export to the US, and two, also gold imports being quite high. For instance, if the trade deal is pushed out into Q1, our base case still remains that you get some announcement by the end of the year. But if that gets pushed out to Q1, you're still having that additional tariff on the MSME sectors, which might be a headwind for growth for the near term. Those are the cases in which our sense is that the RBI will be willing to ease further and quickly. Whereas if it is completely based on inflation, our sense is that it's going to take them slightly longer, because our analysis suggests that the RBI looks at their 12-month forward inflation forecast. And if their 12-month forward inflation forecast comes down, which could be due to multiple factors, for instance, commodity prices lower, or China overcapacity-led deflation spreading into more of the regional inflation numbers. Those are the situations in which the RBI can ease on inflation, but that will take slightly longer.
All right. Let me come back to you, Shantanu. We're going to break away from this conversation for just a bit of a second, because there's China trade data that's just crossing the wires. Let's go across to Elaine Yu in Hong Kong for a breakdown of the numbers. Elaine, what's going on?
Hey, Amitash. So a big surprise here. China's exports in November were up 5.9% that month. So we see China's export engines firing up again after a surprise contraction in October. Now, economists have expected a rebound because November is the first month after the trade truce between the U.S. and China, and that has proven to lift some tensions as exporters, manufacturers are taking advantage of this one-year window, this temporary détente to rush exports. And of course, things could be very unpredictable. So they are taking it by the chance. As we have this truce, they are rushing through exports, and also with China continuing to find success in new markets, especially non-U.S. markets. But looking at imports, they grew 1.9% in November. That's below the 3% forecast by a Reuters poll. So that could continue to create trade frictions with other countries, not just the U.S., but also EU, that are trying to address their trade imbalance with China. And in terms of the trade balance, China is looking at $111.68 billion. That is also beating expectations. So we still have pretty high U.S. tariffs now, and in the longer term, we might be not seeing a material recovery when it comes to bilateral trade. And as we analyze those numbers to non-U.S. markets later, we'll see how sustainable it is for China to rely on, say, African markets, the EU, and also ASEAN markets. But this trade diversion has already raised fresh tensions, not just with the U.S., but also now with Europe, with the French President Emmanuel Macron threatening tariffs during his visit to China, saying if Beijing doesn't take steps to reduce the massive trade surplus that it has with the EU. That's according to an interview published Sunday with the French business newspaper L'Echo. And he's saying that U.S. protectionism means that France is caught in the middle now. And this is a question, he said, of life and death for European industry. So using very strong language here. But still, Morgan Stanley expects China continuing to gain global export market share because of its dominant positions in things like EVs and batteries and also robotics. And now China has goods trade surplus with 177 out of 225 economies. So China could have better luck relying less on the developed economies and continuing to eye those in the emerging world that is more receptive to Chinese goods. Amitosh.
All right. Well, thanks so much for that, Elaine. Great breakdown of what's the latest in terms of trade data coming in from China. We'll come back to you for more, I'm sure. Now, let's just get back to Shantanu Sengupta, Chief India Economist at Goldman Sachs. Shantanu, you were talking about what you predict for the year 2026. I also want to just dive into some of the other comments that the RBI governor made to questions. You mentioned also that the support from OMOs and the FX swap over 3 years is to the tune of 16 billion USD. But how much do you read this as a liquidity measure as opposed to a support of the depreciating rupee? Because that's something that the RBI governor has said is, we're not trying to support the rupee. It's more of a liquidity measure. It's more an art, not a science. I mean, I wasn't quite sure what he meant by that.
So our sense, Amitoj, is that this was totally a liquidity measure. I mean, remember the CRR cuts are done. That's been total 1% of CRR easing. And then the next infusion would have been the dividend that the RBI would pay out around May of next year. So in the interim period, you needed some liquidity infusion because there was some FX intervention-related drain on liquidity that was happening. Because capital flows in general have been muted. Current account was opening up already as we speak. So the RBI chose to do it in two parts. One was OMO. The second was FX buy-sell swap. So this, in our mind, is totally liquidity. On the FX, look, inflation is running at zero. So in our mind, this was the right time likely to depreciate FX a little bit. I mean, in any case, the trade account, as I said, the trade deficit was wider. If you're not getting that much of capital flows right now, instead of intervening, it's probably the right macro trade-off to have a slightly weaker currency when your inflation is that benign. Remember also that if you look at it about a year back, the INR was quite expensive on a real effective exchange rate basis. So inflation adjusted by the trading partners, the INR was quite expensive. And the RBI, in our mind, has now got it more reasonably valued by having a bit of depreciation in the nominal exchange rate over the last 1 year.
Okay, the right trade-off, you say. It appears that the central bank's reluctantly comfortable with that current INR level, even if it hit that psychological mark of 90, it's back down now. We also had the Finance Minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, being asked about this question. So the perception in terms of the narrative is, there are questions being asked about it. And she said that the rupee will find its natural level, adding that exporters are benefiting. Just can you talk to us a little bit about why you think it is the right trade-off? Because there is a perception when the rupee hits 90, there is political repercussion, there is parliament ongoing right now. What does this mean in that context?
I mean, an exchange rate at the end of the day is a nominal variable, so it will adjust over long periods of time with respect to inflation differentials with your trading partner. So we would expect a country with higher inflation than the trading partner for the exchange rate, for its exchange rate to depreciate over time. I think the question is whether it is orderly, that is whether volatility is low or high. If you have a sudden adjustment in the exchange rate, which causes instead of a financial conditions easing, it causes a tightening of financial conditions because credit markets go into a freeze. Those are the kind of situations that you want to avoid. At a time when inflation is running at zero, or near zero at least, if you have the exchange rate depreciation, the feedback into inflation, through imported inflation, is going to be quite low. And that is something that the domestic economy will be able to tolerate when inflation is already this low. And that is really the right trade-off in the RBI's mind right now, we think. And some evidence from us as well as policymakers or academic research has been that the real effective exchange rate has an impact on manufacturing exports. So while commodity exports necessarily might not benefit, but manufacturing exports with a more reasonably valued currency is going to get an impetus.
Where do you see the rupee going in 2026, and what would it take for a meaningful turnaround, given you have two big developments coming, a likely Fed rate cut and continuing uncertainty around the US-India trade deal, so no penalty removal?
Right. So look, our Fed view is that we get a third consecutive 25 base points rate cut to 3.5, 3.75 in December. And then that's followed up by two more rate cuts by the Fed. And our house call is also that of a relatively more benign dollar going into 2026. With that in mind, we think that the INR sort of tops out at the current levels, and you have a slight bit of appreciation, maybe, or at least remain around current levels. Our sense always, has been that the INR tends to underperform the rest of Asian currencies in a dollar weaker cycle, whereas in a stronger dollar cycle, it tends to will tend to outperform. And the reason is that if you think about a weaker dollar, and let's say you have equity flows back into 2026, our view is that the RBI will be accumulating reserves and therefore not letting the INR appreciate materially. So you're probably going higher. If you think about the INR, you're going higher, and then almost like a step function, you remain flat for a while, and then again go higher period of time.
Okay, that's very well explained. Shantanu Sengupta from Goldman Sachs, thanks so much for joining us. We're completely out of time. We'd love to have continued this conversation, but I'm sure we'll have you back soon. Thanks so much for that. All right, coming up, Russian President Vladimir Putin wrapping up his India vowing to strengthen ties with New Delhi. But our next guest believes the South Asian nation doesn't have a lot to gain from this partnership. Don't go anywhere. We've got a chat with Evan Feigenbaum coming up right after the short break. Welcome back. We're counting down to the market open in India, about half an hour away for that. Well, 15 minutes, really. This is how we're shaping up at this point in time. The Nifty 50 closed at 26,186, but GIFT Nifty futures indicating that we could get to as much as 26,322. Wow, that's interesting. Remember, the focus is going to be on how the market has digested over the weekend the RBI's decision to come up with that rate cut, 0.25 basis points, to bring its repo rate, its key interest rate, at 5.25%, and how the dollar reacts, the Indian rupee reacts to the dollar in connection with that. Those are the big developments we'll be watching. There is continued uncertainty around the India-US tariff deal. And remember, there's also the looming decision by the Fed around its own rate cut. All right, the focus on Friday and perhaps over the weekend was on Russian President Vladimir Putin wrapping up a two-day state visit to New Delhi, offering India uninterrupted fuel supplies as both sides agreed to deepen trade and defense ties. But India responded cautiously, signaling that energy purchases will depend on market conditions, sanctions pressure, and commercial viability. The visit comes as India, the top buyer of Russian oil, faces punitive US tariffs. Washington's trade envoy is expected in New Delhi just this week for talks. Prime Minister Narendra Modi called Russia a guiding star in India's foreign policy and announced a new economic cooperation roadmap to 2030. Both countries also signed agreements on labor mobility, fertilizers, agriculture, and defense co-production, including joint manufacturing of spare parts for Russian-origin weapons in India. Here's some of what Putin and Modi had to say about the ties and trade between the two countries.
I want to make it clear. The Russian delegation arrived not just to discuss the energy issues, place orders, and sign contracts for delivery of oil and gas. We want to develop multifaceted relations with India along various tracks. Mr. Prime Minister has repeatedly stressed in our personal conversations that India has huge and growing potential in many areas. But until now, they are not used as we would wish to. And this desire is from both sides.
As per my conversations with President Putin since yesterday and the potential we see, I don't think we'll have to wait until 2030 to achieve the target of $100 billion bilateral trade. I can see it clearly. We are moving forward with the determination to achieve that goal ahead of schedule, and my confidence is increasing.
Joining us to discuss this and more is Evan Feitenbaum. He's the Vice President for Studies at the Asia Pacific, at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thanks so much for that, Evan. Much appreciated that you've come on. I want to start by just asking you a simple question. What's India achieved out of this visit materially, and if it has achieved enough?
Well, you know, I always like to compare the India-Russia relationship to the India-China relationship. There's a lot of hoo-ha here in the United States about both of those bilaterals. The relationship with Russia is a relationship of considerable trust from which India has been trying for quite a bit of time to diversify. The relationship with China, by contrast, is a relationship of zero trust, but that has a considerable amount of unrealized economic potential. So not surprisingly, the trust is important because it means that India is signaling to the United States, to the Europeans, and to others that it will not, under any circumstances, junk its relationship with Russia, particularly under American pressure, that it intends to pursue productive relations with all of the major centers of power in its own interest. And those optics and that signaling is important. And that's why, really, the bottom line for me, the visit was long on optics, and it was, despite all those agreements you just mentioned, kind of short on substance. The optics are the point. For the Russians, the point of the signaling is to showcase to the United States and especially to Europe that Russia is not isolated and cannot be isolated, and India is part of that picture. And as I said, for India, the signaling, especially to Washington, is that pressure is unacceptable and India will make its own choices. And I think in that sense, both sides came away with it basically achieving their optical goals.
Interesting. Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar was the one who actually saw off Vladimir Putin to his plane when it was Mr. Modi who received him. And he was speaking at a forum, and he said, according to him, the two takeaways from the Russia meet were the mobility agreement and the joint venture on fertilizers. But in your sense, that's still short on substance. My question to you is this then. How could it be anything more than short on substance when anything more would have really erred some other Western folks?
Well, first, the mobility agreement in itself is quite depressing. I mean, this is not to cast aspersions on India at all. It's really a comment about Russia. But the Russian regime has killed off in Ukraine an entire generation of Russians. And so the fact that it needs labor mobility agreements to import labor to do jobs that Russians can and should have says something about the lost generation in Russia. I mean, obviously, there's a trade relationship. Every time Russian and Indian policymakers get together, things tend to concentrate around defense and energy, because there really is a question about how Russia answers the larger question India is facing. And that's really the question I would put to you and your viewers, which is, at the end of the day, given India's agendas around growth, employment, upskilling, sustainability, what is the problem that India is trying to solve, to which expanded partnership with Russia is the answer? It's not addressing the strategic challenge from China, because Russia and China are quite close, both strategically and operationally. It's not really in the financial area, notwithstanding that more trade is denominated in rupees and in rubles. That's largely for trade settlement. I can't imagine a scenario in which India wants to make itself dependent on Russian monetary policy and yoke its economy to the Bank of Russia. Technological upgrading, yes, but it's limited to a few areas. Economic growth, maybe, dealing with the trade pressure from the United States. But frankly, there are limits on that, and Russia really can't swap out as an export destination. So at the end of the day, it's why I always return to the optics. And I think in a lot of ways, this partnership, important as it is to India, sentimental as it is to India, and Americans have to get used to that fact and accept it. It's just, at the end of the day, India has a self-interested approach to the world. And that's why I think there are some inherent limits on it. And I think that showed in the outcomes of the visit.
Just if I could, for the viewers, answer that and try to get your thoughts on a little bit of discussion around that. There's unmatched trust, unprecedented trust with Russia, right? And that's been built upon at a time when we've had a conflict with Pakistan. India's had a conflict with Pakistan a couple of months ago. Ties with the US are at its lowest. So you need to kind of re-show that trust and rebuild that trust when India has been trying to diversify away from Russia, so-called isolated. And also, it's not easy for any country diplomatically to announce a defense deal with Russia, but perhaps move closer towards understanding around defense deals. When you have the US effectively watching every move that India makes towards Russia. And at the same time, which country has wholesale potential that is achieved with any other country when it's usually incremental? I know you've said that that potential lies with China, but apart from China, where there's very little trust, you yourself said zero trust, isn't this what could have been achieved as a maximum anyway with Russia?
Yeah, maybe. And I think that's the point. You know, Mr. Jaishankar you mentioned Mr. Jaishankar, he wrote a book in 2021 called The India Way, in which he talked about Indian foreign policy really being yoked to India's own self-interest in India's agendas, which is the right way to think about it. He talked about exploiting opportunities from global contradictions. And frankly, the global contradictions among other outside powers are really to India's advantage. So both, not surprisingly, but also in its own interest, India is pursuing that set of relationships. My point about China was just that it's undershot the economic potential, but the reality is that the trust is extremely limited and is going to remain that way for a long time. As for the United States, I mean, I've had a lot to say about this, both on this network and in some of the writing that I've done. I think the Trump administration in many ways has basically undone the trust, and they've really unraveled 20 plus years of work that multiple administrations, including, frankly, President Trump's first administration, did to build up habits of cooperation between the United States and India, which was not easy. I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia at the end of the George W. Bush administration. We did the famous civil nuclear deal during that period. A lot of that trust has unraveled. To be blunt about it, I think the United States is viewed in India now as hypocritical at best, and contradictory at worst. And that's also true of the American criticisms of Indian policy on Russia, and Americans are going to have to deal with that fact. You know, we're in a week now where in the last few days, the Kremlin has been praising a national security strategy that the White House put out. Kirill Dmitriev and Alexander Dugin are tweeting support for American foreign policy. Mr. Witkoff and Jared Kushner were just in the Kremlin the other day. The United States has teased rolling back some sanctions, maybe doing commercial deals. And then, as you mentioned earlier in the program, the United States still has the 25% tariff linked to Russian oil purchases that's layered on top of the base tariff. And that's at a time when the United States has not imposed those tariffs, even on European countries like Hungary or China that still purchase Russian oil. So the United States has to reckon with that. And frankly, it's going to be a long way back. I do think there's going to be a trade deal at some point, because as I said earlier, when I talked about the limits on India-Russia trade, that is in India's interest and it's in the American interest. But I think at the end of the day, the trust is gone and it's going to take a long time to rebuild that.
Long time to rebuild the trust. Okay, but just talk to us a little bit about the contradictions, because when you have this growing narrative around the contradictions, which is perhaps catching up to the US narrative, which is indicated, perhaps, as you've suggested wrongly, that India is buying oil from Russia and therefore fueling or rather funding the Ukraine war. The White House National Security Strategy that was released over the weekend that you referred to also said a couple of things: that we must continue to improve commercial relations with India, to enlist our European, Asian allies and partners, including India, to cement and improve our joint positions in the Western Hemisphere. All of these statements made at a time when it's continuing to impose the highest tariffs in the world on India. Is the U.S., is it possible that the U.S. is even losing this tariff narrative to India?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I thought the India section of the National Security Strategy read like it was written by ChatGPT. It was kind of a throwaway. There was a mention of Quad, there was a mention of Indo-Pacific, but if you contrast it with prior national security strategies, including the one written by President Trump's team in his first term, it really was kind of a throwaway. I think the United States is going through some things, frankly, domestically. Its commitment to providing public goods around the world is clearly at the center of the debate between the Trump administration and more traditional American approaches to foreign policy. And what that means is that we have a much more instrumental American approach to partnerships, alliances all around the world, and India's been caught betwixt and between. So I think, frankly, it's not for me as an American to give advice to India, but my suspicion is that India will be as self-interested about its own national interest as the Trump administration is being about what it defines as the American national interest. And as I said earlier, that's not surprising, and it's something that the United States is going to have to reckon with in U.S.-India relations. I think over the longer term, though, the question is what's being lost. And for an India that wants to create balances of power that favor its own agenda, which, as I said, begins not just with strategic stability, but also with growth, employment, upskilling, sustainability, technological transformation. As Prime Minister Modi says, making more in India, attracting capital flow. Russia, as I said earlier, is not the magic bullet for that. It's not really the answer to most of those. And so I think, India's in a tough spot where it's going to have to pursue relations with a variety of partners: Japan, Europe, the United States, others. And that's just the reality that we're facing.
Okay, so I'm not sure I heard you answering the question of who's winning the narrative war, so you can jump into that as I ask you the second question. You talked about walking the tightrope. India is walking this tightrope of, Deputy U.S. Trade Representative Rick Switzer is traveling to India today for that trade deal. Negotiating with the U.S., that's what India is doing, while it has invited Russia. Could India fall off this tightrope, given that there is a mercurial Donald Trump on the other side?
Well, it's hard to psychoanalyze President Trump. I often compare him to what we call alternate side of the street parking in New York City. This is a street cleaning measure where a few days of the week you can park on the left side and a few days of the week you can park on the right side. You never know quite which side President Trump's going to be on. But it's very clear, as I said, that a self-interested view, both from Washington and from New Delhi, would suggest that we really ought to get a trade deal at some point. So I wish them luck with that. I'm surprised it hasn't happened sooner. I think that's not to the credit of either side, but particularly to the American side. I mean, India's not alone in this. There's been a lot of unfair. You asked the question about the narrative. Who's losing the narrative? I mean, frankly, it's the United States globally. Although here domestically in the United States, there are still plenty of people who support President Trump's protectionist measures and his approach to trade. And he has a good political instinct, and he's really looking at his base domestically. But critiques that I've heard sometimes of Prime Minister Modi and the Indian government that somehow they misjudge President Trump or the administration, those are, in my view, deeply unfair. I mean, take a look at Japan, take a look at Canada, take a look at South Korea, take a look at all the ASEAN countries. I mean, the best that any of the ASEAN countries did was basically the 19% base on Indonesia and a few others. Vietnam got 20, 40% for transshipment. Canada and Mexico are still stuck in a box. So I think this is just what everybody's dealing with. It's a very different United States, and it's a United States that doesn't view access to its market or as a public good, and doesn't view its role as a standard setter through trade pacts. But I do hope that they'll get to an agreement soon, and that's my expectation. The larger question is the trust, and I think that's really been unraveled.
Yeah, I want to just go back to the point that you were making about you don't see any major problem that India faces to which closer ties with Russia is a solution. And I wanted to just bring it out there that there's that trade deficit between Russia and India, which is to the tune of about, 60 billion, 69 is the total, and only 5 billion is contributed by India. So while that's something that both the leaders have indicated it is possible, I know, have already indicated that it's going to be incremental. It's not a big deal. It's not going to be much of a change. So I get that. But I want to finish perhaps on our last question, where one was hearing enough about Su-59 stealth jets and S-500 shields given to India from Russia. But there is a role that China plays in technologically creating them in Russia. So that connection between China, Russia, and India would not be suitable for India's defense needs. And you also already indicated that the focus of this trip has been disproportionately on the US when it should be on China. So just give us some color on all of these points.
Look, I mean, to be fair, I'm making a rhetorical point when I say what is the problem that India faces that Russia can solve. Obviously, there are benefits to India in India's interpretation that flow from a relationship with Russia. There are defense ties, there are technological ties, there are educational ties. There's lots going on. You heard the leaders talk about that. It's not necessary to American or European liking, but it's a fact of life. I think the larger question is if you step up and you take it up to the strategic level, the principal strategic challenge that India faces is really from China. And the reality is, and I don't think Americans always face up to this, is that one reason why India pursues its relationship with Russia is not just sentimental, it's not just historical. It's also, frankly, to forestall the possibility of Russia-China collusion in India's own neighborhood, particularly in South Asia. Over the last few years, we've seen Russia play a little bit of footsie with Pakistan. Russia's had a role in Afghanistan historically. And then there's this question of the Russia-China technological and economic relationship. That is a challenge for India, because at the end of the day, the idea of splitting that Russia-China partnership, in my view, right now is absolutely fanciful. And so forestalling collusion is one thing, but the problem that India faces from greater technological reliance on Russia, notwithstanding the longstanding defense ties and the fact that India will continue to buy some defense equipment, is that at the end of the day, the Russia-China technological relationship is growing closer, not weaker, and that will implicate India's interests in a variety of ways. So for an India that wants to deter China, but also whose technological upgrading is designed in part to compete with China, Russia, as I said, and again, I'm making a rhetorical point, is really not the magic bullet, much less the answer to the most important problems that bedevil India's development trajectory.
Fantastic, riveting perspective. Thanks so much. That was Evan Feigenbaum from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Evan, I look forward to having you back on the show. Thanks so much for that. All right, oil prices. Let's take a quick look at that. Remember, there was a comment that came in from Russian President Vladimir Putin, who said that Moscow was ready to continue ensuring uninterrupted fuel supplies to India. This is happening while the US is pressuring India to curb oil purchases from Russia. At the moment, you can see the prices hitting 60, WTI crude at 60.18, ICE Brent 63, Murban at 65. A lot happening. Remember, India also saying that it's going to be cautious about that particular suggestion from Vladimir Putin. Now, CNBC is hosting the inaugural New Energy Finance Forum at Abu Dhabi Finance Week. Steve Sedgwick is on the ground hosting that event, and he joins us now for what to expect. Steve, I'm pretty sure it's really, really exciting out there.
Yeah, really. By the way, Amitaj, what a fantastic show you have as well. I've been listening to you for about the last 30 minutes. You are absolutely fantastic, and I'm loving your program as well. So next time you're in London, please come and join us on Squawk Box Europe as well. Right, okay, back to what I'm doing here in Abu Dhabi. Look, I'll tell you the truth. I've been coming to Abu Dhabi for 15, 20, 25 years. I lose track half the time as well. And most of the time when I've been out here has been in my capacity covering energy and energy-related issues. And kind of that's why I'm here as well this time round. But the fact of the matter is, most of that was looking backwards at hydrocarbons or looking at current day hydrocarbons. But now, this is very, very interesting. We're looking at how various energy sources, not just hydrocarbons from this region and elsewhere, can fuel what is quite frankly a revolution going on in the world at the moment. We all know what it is, and it's AI. And I just think that the world is completely and utterly unprepared for the demands of AI. And if there ever is going to be a problem with AI adoption, it's not going to come from the fact there's not enough large language models around. We know there's Gemini, there's Anthropic, and a small company called OpenAI in the private markets as well. So we all know that there's a lot of large language model that's going to surge onto the market. We're not worried about the chips, are we? We know that NVIDIA and the Chinese and all kinds of other players are building the chips for the revolution in AI. But a lot of people are completely lacking in their understanding of where the problem comes in. It's the bottleneck in energy to supply this unbelievable revolution we're seeing here. And that is what I'm doing here in Abu Dhabi with Dan Murphy and the rest of my magnificent team. I've got my producer Joan here, I've got camera operator Michael. We've got a massive team here as well. And we're looking at the problems that could evolve, and indeed the opportunities. It's not just problems, but that could evolve from the fact that we haven't necessarily taken seriously the increased energy usage demands that are going to come from AI. Shall I give you some of the numbers? I've got so many numbers lined up as well. Basically, the energy demand from data centers alone has grown by 12% a year in the last 5 years. The IEA, which, let's be honest about it, the IEA gets some of its base case scenarios wrong, but its base case is that this demand is going to double to 945 terawatt hours by 2030 and could get to 1,720 terawatt hours by 2035. What does that mean, though? What is a terawatt hour? Well, 945 is pretty much 3% of global electricity. You can't just find an extra 3% of electricity just out of a hat kind of thing. So it's going to be about renewables, it's going to be about hydrocarbons, it's going to be about clean energy tech. So there is a vast amount of new energy that's going to be needed. By the way, the good news is AI can also streamline a lot of our processes. It can cut outages, it can do better monitoring, it can monitor methane as well. So it's not a one-way track. It's not AI just sucking good energy out of the system. It's actually benefiting our usage and creating all kinds of benefits in the energy infrastructure as well. But it's going to be absolutely fascinating. I'm genuinely very excited to be here, and I'm genuinely, Amitaj, very excited to be on your show. It's a fantastic show.
Thank you so much for that. I cannot thank you enough. Steve Sedgwick out there, a legend within CNBC. Thank you for coming and bringing all that energy to Abu Dhabi. I feel like we're going to need to cool things down there with you there. Thanks so much for that. Okay, Indian markets have joined the trading day. We will look at some movers in Mumbai right after this short break. It's winter there. Let's give you a sense of what's going on right now. Well, slightly muted. We'll come back in a bit. Welcome back. Indian markets have come online. Nifty 50 muted start, 26,157, when projections through GIFT Nifty indicated that it could go all the way up to actually 26,300. Remember, the market still digesting from over the weekend. The comments coming out from the Indian central bank around its monetary policy. It did cut the rate 0.25% and really shrugged off concerns around the rupee. But take a look at what's happened with the rupee. The rupee was at 89.8. It's already gone up to 90.08. We'll be watching that very closely. We also continue to watch Interglobe Aviation, the operators of the airline Indigo, following the cancellation of thousands of flights over the past week. India's aviation watchdog has warned it will take regulatory action, while CEO Peter Elbers has been issued a show-cause notice accusing him of failing in his duty to ensure reliable operations. The shares of Interglobe over the past few days down about 5%, currently 4%. That's all the time, though, that we have today on Inside India. Keep watching CNBC. We're taking another flight right up next. It's Axis Middle East, and they've got something really riveting coming up. Don't go anywhere.